Hi, welcome to another Kintsugi podcast. And today we're speaking to the amazing Jane Mulcahy, who is one of the most vocal kind of advocates for change around, she'll correct me if I'm wrong, criminal justice environments for trauma-informed responsive system change. So I can natter on forever, but I think Jane can introduce herself.
Hi, folks. I'm delighted to be here. It's really exciting to join you, Rob and Niamh. And that's pretty much true, Rob, in the sense that criminal justice is where I've worked for a long time now, mainly in a research capacity, research and activism, I guess. And you're right in saying that I'm vocal about how trauma is very central to the lives and experiences of people who've ended up committing crimes. It's central to people's experiences of addiction, I think, too, and mental health challenges. And often in our prison system, in any country in the world, prisons are filled with poor people who have not just economic poverty, but also emotional and relational poverty, and who have had terrible things happen to them. And sometimes they've done terrible things to other people. But my view is if we actually want to try to interrupt the cycle, if we want to stop further crimes being committed, then we need to acknowledge the elephant in the room, which is the trauma that people have experienced, and try to provide services and supports to them that will help them be the best that they can be, because I do believe that healing is possible. I've seen it, and it's a beautiful thing when it happens. So delighted to be here.
Well, delighted to have you, and thank you very much for giving your time up, because I know you're very busy. And I'd agree with everything that you just said. That I think it is the elephant in the room, is dealing with the transmission of trauma through our justice system, and how the people who are in it are clearly responsible for crimes that you commit, and any harm that's done to others from that that's dysregulation of your emotional control. But we really need to understand how to switch off the dysregulation, because that pays dividends for everybody, including the person who's dysregulated. And I've kind of seen people who you would think would never be able to transition from that dysregulation, who actually have and lead very kind of calm lives and grow and develop and cause no more harm to either themselves or anybody else. And clearly that must be the objective.
Yes. And sometimes people who've done harm, who've been harmed and done harm, sometimes quite serious harm, can go on to be profound healers themselves, because once they've learned the reasons why, and sometimes mainstream criminology can focus an awful lot on the poverty side of things, the economic and structural disadvantage, which of course is there. It's true. It's inherently stressful just to be poor. But lots of poor people don't ever commit crimes or harm others. So what else is there? It's that poverty plus relational violence and relational neglect. When you combine those things and then are emotionally dysregulated, and maybe learn that violence is a coping strategy, or taking a cocktail of drugs is a coping strategy, well, then you can go on and violate the rights of others. But once you realize the importance of safety and attachment, and learn tools to modulate your arousal and regulate your nervous system, well, then you can be anything a lot of the time. You can be profoundly moving. And some of my favorite people in the field are men and women who've been in the justice system, who've done bad things, and now can speak with such an honesty and a vulnerability and a beauty, I think, in trying to raise awareness of how we need to attend to trauma more, to prevent crimes being committed.
And of course, for society, the enormity of some of those crimes, the violent crimes. So put aside sexual crimes just for a second, because I talk about those as well. But for violent crimes, I grew up with people who went on to be bank robbers, literally were bank robbers. And I've served time for bank robbery. Just that's a violent crime, because often you have to threaten people with weapons and to obtain the wherever they obtained and do the time. And I kind of, they still float around some of my networks now, and they were destroyed by the trauma and the knowledge of what it's done to their lives. They take responsibility for the crimes they committed, but it destroyed just not them, but the people around them, their families. Never mind the impacts on people. It's how we go and end that process and end the cycle, if you like, because their parents are disordered in the sense that they couldn't hold the dysfunctional management of the dysfunctional management of the regulation. So how do you intervene both at the beginning of the process for children and do that in a way that doesn't inflict? We all know the history of looked after care across both the islands that we live on. So we know that that hasn't been the success story that it should have been for the last 100 years, because children who put into institutional care often re-traumatized by the institutional environments and the people in them, not always. Some of those children's homes that I've talked to people over the years were most wonderful places of sanctuary for children. And they were basically driven by the people in them. So that was run by people who really knew how to create sanctuary for children. And that's what looked after care should be, really, isn't it? Sanctuary for children, because they're often escaping all that dysregulation of the adults around them, including direct violent abuse, both physical, emotional, and sexual. So it's how do we intervene so we end the pipeline, if you like, of people for the criminal justice system, whilst dealing with the legacies of the pipeline, so that we're dealing with it at both ends. So we're not just we're upstream and downstream, because I think that strategically is the only way you're going to end or halve, which is the UK government's current strategy or aim, is to halve interpersonal violence by 50% within 2 parliaments, which is a massive mountain to climb. That is a massive mountain. I'm not sure the strategy for doing that has been finalised. We'll find out soon, probably during the summer. But you're going to have to work, in my view, and I don't know if you will agree with this, and if Neve's view or this will be, I think you can't do that by just focusing on what I think European Parliament called a strategy, was called the ABC strategies, which basically go for children. You have to go for the adults as well, because you need to be upstream and downstream to achieve that strategy.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I'd agree with the fact that you can't just look at prevention, because, to prevent, you do need to upskill the adults in the children's worlds. So for me, awareness is the first step. And that's partly why since I've really kind of learned more about trauma and just how prevalent it is, and how we need to feel safe in order to function, to be healthy, to connect, to learn, to collaborate. And really, the world is quite unsafe, it seems, at the moment. There's an awful lot of dysregulation, an awful lot of fear-driven behaviour, and lashing out at the others, not wanting immigrants, not wanting this, not wanting the other, being terrified of trans people. There's just an awful lot of irrational fear. And of course, fear is kind of irrational, but it's emotional, it's existential. So we need to look at the fear in adults in order to try to prevent fear-driven childhoods, because you don't end up, hating LGBT people from the time you're born. Those views have to be bred into you. Or hatred of black people or brown people's bodies. We have to look at why there's so many people who have these fears, and what those fears then do to other people's children and adults who are walking around in the world. I mean, there's a lot of dysregulated people because of racism. Their bodies don't feel safe in the presence of white bodies for good reason. White bodies mightn't feel safe in the presence of black or brown bodies, perhaps for less good reason, or sometimes because they might have experienced something themselves directly, some kind of violence or aggression. But I think we absolutely have to look at preventing trauma from occurring in the first instance. So creating the conditions in children's homes and communities that are conducive to their health and well-being and flourishing and connection. Some of that are economic policies. Some of that is around supporting maternity services, maternal health, so that moms are better placed to be loving and nurturing to their children. It's not that easy. I'm a mom myself. There are times it's really challenging. We need supports. You need a loving partner, ideally, to support you, whether a male partner or a female, it doesn't really matter. You need support. So we cannot grow healthy children disconnected from healthier adults. So you're absolutely right, Rob, that we have to look at improving the conditions, improving the regulation of adults. Like, I'm a work in progress myself. I know all about this, or I know a lot. I'm learning more all the time. Does it mean that I'm always emotionally regulated? No, it does not. So awareness is one thing. Putting strategies into practice is another thing. Noticing your own dysregulation, going for a walk, doing your breathing, doing your yoga, doing your journaling, whatever works for you to be better placed to attend to the needs of children, because they are needy, they are emotional, they are demanding, and in order to be least harmful in our interactions, we need to look at ourselves. All of us, all the adults need to look at ourselves. So parents need to look at themselves, but also teachers. Anyone interacting with children and anyone interacting with adults needs to watch their own bodies, their nervous system, the regulation, and try and improve themselves. So awareness is the first step. And after that, it's a constant job, really, to reduce harm, I think. I hope that makes some kind of sense.
It makes perfect sense. And for context, we're recording this approximately 72 hours after one of the most visible dysregulation events in the history of the American presidency, where the president and the vice president of the United States, in effect, projected their emotional dysregulation and abusive tendencies onto another individual in the room with cameras blazing. And the world has never seen such a thing, I don't think, in that kind of heightened visible thing. And it illustrates, doesn't it, really, that there is dysfunction at all levels of our system. And we vote for people who are dysfunctional. So we vote for people and we make them our leaders for reasons that are very complex, when we kind of sense that they're not regulated in many ways, yet we still vote for them. So that poses a question for me after 25 years of being out here. What is the answer to dealing with reversing all of this? What are the barriers, and what is it about us as a species that continues to look the other way, to not look at the unspeakable, to moralize about things in relation to crime, when actually what we should be doing is just dealing with it as a rational process of reducing it. And that doesn't mean punishment is important, but if it's just about punishment, you're just going to feed the prisons forever, and they're just going to grow and grow in a world. So what are the barriers that you see, Jane? And what do you think the answers are to bringing those barriers down, perhaps?
Well, that's a massive question, and I'm not sure I have all the answers, or really any answers to it. I would say I did not watch that kind of abomination the other night for my own mental health, really. I was like, I cannot watch this. I read about it, and that was enough. But I think that we are seeing rampaging bullying from the most powerful man in the world is really frightening and worrying. He also told us in advance what he would do, and now he's doing it. I heard Mel Gibson say after Trump was elected that, he was delighted because Daddy's come home and is taking his belt off. That is frightening. Why do people want Daddy to come home and take his belt off? What type of upbringing have they had that this is appealing? And Alice Miller, before, when Hitler was elected, she said, in a way, the leanings towards totalitarianism come from, you know, these abusive authority figures and being unconsciously attracted to that abuse, strangely. So traumatic reenactment can occur in a range of ways. And if we don't know about our own patterns, if we've repressed our own experiences, the harms that have been caused to us, well, we can be drawn to repeat them in various ways. So that's one thing. I think that as a species, we are drawn to repeat bad things that have happened to us, either as victim or as perpetrator sometimes. So that's one. Two, I think it's a trauma response to want to disconnect from our environment. So I said I couldn't watch it. I couldn't. So that's avoidance. Avoidance is a coping strategy. Avoidance of other people's pain is a coping strategy. When our bodies feel unsafe because of the emotions surging from other people's bodies, we might want to avoid it, run for the hills. And in a previous discussion with you, Rob, we were talking about child sexual abuse and how people want to stuff their fingers in their ears and close their eyes. I think that's in a way, sadly, a natural response to something that is so painful. And there's a lot of pain in the world. So there's a lot of us want to run away from people's pain, whether it's the pain of racism, whether it's the pain of poverty or the pain of domestic and gender-based violence. We kind of can't bear to see or hear about it some of the time. So that is part of the problem. But we have to confront them because we do also realize, some of the time at least, that these are really harmful things that are happening to too many people. And we can't just close our eyes and stuff our fingers in our ears and hope for them to go away. But the impulse, I think, to want it to go away and not want to hear is kind of natural in a self-defense, self-protective type of mode. But my own belief, I suppose, is to try and reduce these harms is we have to tolerate a level of discomfort. Our bodies have to start being able to go, oh, I'm white. I've benefited in ways I may not realize from white supremacy. I'm going to be part of the problem if I don't step up and say, okay, I think we need to move towards anti-racism and try and, you know, honor the harms that have been caused by colonialism, by this, that, and the other. Similarly, I think men have to step up and acknowledge that sexism and misogyny are real. They're harmful. They're really harmful to girls and women. They're actually kind of harmful to men too. But we have to be willing to hear what people have to say about these harms and not just go, oh, it's not all men or not all white people, you know, and minimize and kind of say, it's not me, you know, and I don't want to hear any more about it. But on the other hand, I think we can only tolerate so much at a given time. So we mightn't always feel strong enough to be allies because of overwhelming our own lives, you know. So I think it's a bit unrealistic sometimes to think people who might be really overwhelmed with their own relational problems or family problems or financial problems to be thinking bigger than their own little world. And so I think there's also that trauma response of too many people with unprocessed personal trauma kind of just being in survival mode at that level. So we kind of have to try and heal as many individuals as we can, you know, bring information to people, try and welcome people into spaces, try and go at a pace that is reasonable for them, because we're not all equally situated. We're not all equally privileged. My own capacity for this varies, you know, and I think that's fair enough to honor that, you know, that sometimes we've more to give. Sometimes we can be more open and receptive. That's the state of our nervous system. If we've greater nervous system awareness in general, we can be more compassionate for our own reserves and know what we're capable of at a given moment. And then come more together in groups, you know, sharing similar concerns so that we can maybe pick up some of the heavy lifting when other people need to back away for a while. Those are just a few ideas, but it's not simple. It can be overwhelming to think of all the things that are going wrong, but it's never been maybe so urgent either, that, you know, with the climate crisis and things, we've got to look at the reality and we have to try and take action. Yeah.
I mean, it is a big question, isn't it? It's a massive issue, and there's a lot of themes there you kind of to unpack. I mean, one of the expressions I heard the other day was managed decline for Western democracies, which is basically what the current narrative is around why we are fading away, and these totalitarian kind of strong men. There's a strong woman in Italy as well who's kind of aligned with their views, are emerging, and people want stability, don't they, and security about kind of knowing what you've just been saying, they want their world to be safe. They do not want to have it challenged by things. Yet it is going to be challenged. The internet, you know, is a machine out of control with AI coming. The exploitation of children, especially boys online, is increasing exponentially. We have a society, and what the situation you're speaking from Ireland, I presume, is in the United Kingdom. We're looking at 8.8 million people who are on antidepressant medication, and that's gone up hundreds % over the last 10 years. So, you know, there's something going on in us. I'm not pill shaming people for taking antidepressants, but, you know, there's a reality that you're speaking about is our inability to face reality. So if you argue from the point of antidepressants, and people, when you speak to them, will tell you this openly, they just want to be suppressed. They want to be numbed. And of course, numbing is great if it works, but it doesn't get rid of the problems that are creating the need for the numbing.
No.
So we have all of that going on, and a world of increasing violence, both state violence, you know, hopefully not to a level that's any higher than it is at the moment. Plus, you have interpersonal violence; those levels are not decreasing. So the figures, while the police are funded to do to fight these crimes, you know, the statistics showing that, you know, it's an uphill struggle for them to even get close to bringing, in our particular context of we work, sexual violence. You know, there's a couple of points moved on the percentage scale, but we are talking points in a percent, not in large, significant numbers in change in relation to bringing prosecutions, for instance. So, you know, and that's when the focus of the state is on that as an equivalent act to terrorism. Yet they can only shift it by a couple of points within a percent, you know, to kind of make it above 2%. 2.1, 2.2 is seen as a success for sexual violence crime, you know, and that, you know, you have to get to 80% to be a success, in my view, because that's the nature of dealing with it, is to do that. How do you do that? So, and then workers in the NHS are facing, you know, the challenge that society is changing. We're seeing lots of young men coming forward to our service who would, you know, almost all of them now are in their early 20s who are coming forward, you know, and that is a massive cultural shift. It just wouldn't have happened. So it's good to take a deep breath, isn't it? And kind of hope to be optimistic for change. You have to be optimistic for change, because our species has always been able to, at some point, emerge from this kind of stuff greater and stronger and more aware of them.
And I suppose that is one of the benefits of the internet and social media, is that young people can access information. Not all of it is helpful, but they can access some information that is helpful to them, and, you know, take some of the shame and blame that in previous generations might have been so internalized, and that things were unspoken publicly or in any kind of way. There was so much that was taboo, and a lot of the taboos have been blown out by the internet. So I do think that trend in young men speaking about harms that they've experienced and intimate violations, that is a wonderful development, because if you can name it and shift the blame and shame onto the rightful party, the perpetrator or perpetrators, as the case may be, and you do that early in your life, well, your chances of healing are so much better than if you have to make it to 70 or whatever, as the case can sometimes be, before someone says that was never yours. You were never at fault. So like that is a great thing. The other problem, I think, a reason that so many people are unwell these days, or more unwell, or more depressed and more anxious, is because we're quite disconnected. Like, we are hyper connected online, and I know you, Rob, from online, from Twitter, and I've met loads of people online, and I've learned so much from people, which is wonderful. But too many of us are on our phones more than we are connecting to people in the real world. And that is not good for us. I think it was Bruce Perry who was saying, like, our brains are designed to interact with maybe maximum 150 people. And if they're interacting with more than that, we cannot cope, really. And people could be sort of interacting with hundreds or thousands, maybe, but it's a poor substitute for real relationships in the real world. So I think that's an aspect of it too. When you see families, and my own family is similar in this regard. We could be all on separate devices, not watching TV anymore, not watching movies. And that's not good for anyone, when we're doom scrolling instead of actually properly talking. And there might be a place for some of it, but I do think we need to get back into actual activities and business meetings more in person than everything online. And people, since COVID, a lot of people don't want to go in person. They've gone lazy. They like, doing the laundry or whatever at home. People need to move their asses and actually get into the real world and move their bodies, because that's regulating. Walking to the meeting is regulating. Actually engaging with other people can be energizing. It can also be draining, but I just think we're not meant to be on electronics the whole time. And so while there are the benefits mental health wise, there are also the downsides. I think it's kind of the light and dark, a bit like human beings. There's a shadow side to everything. And if we don't kind of confront that, and again, it's about emotional regulation, isn't it? It's kind of like, am I addicted to my phone now? It mightn't be crack cocaine, but can I actually come off this and interact with people? So many people addicted to pornography, young men and men addicted to pornography, not able to have a proper relationship and not wanting one. They might glorify this, but it comes at a cost.
I'd love to jump in here, because I think as someone who's like grown up with social media, it's kind of grown with me as well. So having the experience of having it from such a young age, and I completely agree with everything that you said. I think that especially young people, it's been great in terms of like education about things. Like a lot of the reason that I am the activist I am today is because of what I read and found on social media. Like, that was the avenue for me to kind of access all that information, which is really good. But at the same time, you have a constant stream of information, and it's really hard to disconnect from, especially when you're kind of like addicted. I mean, I'd probably admit I am addicted to my phone in a way, because
I am
it's
too, Niamh.
it's really hard to not be. I think, especially as we've shifted into a much more like social media world where everything is there and everyone is there, and it's almost that fear of missing out on this social media instead of fear of missing out on like real life experiences. Because there's so much, like, if you take a day away, you might miss all of this information or news that has come through. But I think that we're constantly drained because we're constantly consuming. And I think that puts a lot of people in a difficult place to actually act. Because I mean, I know at the minute with everything that with Trump and just everything generally, it's so overwhelming that I just feel like it's completely unattainable, this huge mountain to climb. And I think that's the thing that a lot of people, it maybe stops them from wanting to engage in any form of social action because they have no idea where to start, or they just think like, oh, I can't do anything myself. And I
Yeah.
think it's really difficult. And yeah, I think people are just overstimulated. I think we consume so much that really we're not meant to consume that much, that all the information, and I'm not really sure if our brains are actually built to kind of process everything we see on our phones constantly. It's a completely new experience. I think before you'd maybe have a newspaper and you'd read the news for that day, and that would be the information that you consume, but now like you have unlimited access to that, and you also have social media apps that are built to keep you engaged. Like they used to have an end.
Mm.
They used to say you've caught up on everything that's been posted today. Now you can just go on forever and ever, and it just constantly keeps you consumed. And I think that's a danger for young people, especially because when you've grown up with it, you don't know any different. And I think as well with social media echo chambers, that's how you get people who get so stuck in one idea or one way of thinking because they're constantly being shown the things that they engage with. So that's how you get people kind of going into these like far right spaces, or even sometimes I think I'm like, oh, everything's so great, I'm seeing all this good stuff, and then I'm like, that's because I'm in my echo chamber of things that are going well. So I think it's a really difficult thing to navigate, and I think we also haven't been given the tools to navigate it because it's still really new.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really interesting. There's another thing from earlier as well, which is kind of changing the topic a little bit. But I was wondering about your thoughts about kind of people seeing people as a crime and not as a person, and kind of like how that influences the way that people see and engage with people that have been in prison or have been convicted of crimes. Because I think a lot of people they kind of see things very simplistically as like people are bad or good, and we know that that's just it's not that simple. I was just wondering if you had like any reflections on maybe why you think that people might see people in that way, or just some reflections on that generally.
Yeah, thanks, Niamh. Well, on that last point, I think for people who commit more serious offences where they harm other human beings, certainly the tendency to look at them from an unenlightened, uninformed position, with a lot of their own personal privilege as well, kind of going, I could never be like that. You know, this person is the monster type of narrative. That's more common if you've been violent, you know, and certainly there would be some violent men, more violent men who are convicted, but women can also be violent, and women tend to be violent to their children, which is a controversial thing for me to say, but it's part of the issue, I think, because if we want to target gender-based violence and hatred of women on the part of men, we have to look at where they might be getting it. And sometimes they might be getting it because their own caregivers have been violent to them, I think. So we need to look at that. But also the wider culture that glorifies male violence at times. Or it gives men mixed messages. It says, don't be violent, but at the same time, don't allow other boys or men pick on you, you know, be a man. Some of our narratives around what it actually means to be a man are really distorted and unhelpful and extremely damaging to little boys. And then women and girls pay the brunt of that sometimes, but so do guys. So actually, male violence is more of a problem towards other men and boys, you know. And so if you grow up in a poor community where there's a lot of interpersonal trauma in families, but also in the community, your chances of being a victim of violence and a perpetrator of violence are so much higher than if you grow up in a safe household where your basic needs are met and you're loved and nurtured, and your community isn't an unsafe community, there you don't need to be violent, because you don't need it as a coping strategy to keep you safe. So I think, like, what I've learned is we have all got the capacity to be physically and emotionally violent to one another. We won't learn that capacity if we don't need to, so like a fight response, lashing out physically might be what is needed in a moment, or what that person's body thinks they need to do in that moment. They feel that the nervous system is telling them, I am unsafe. That may or may not be objectively correct. But if they lash out physically, they can end up in a court of law and convicted as a violent offender, someone who is a danger and a harm to others. And there are some people who, because of what they've experienced their whole lives, have become quite dangerous objectively, because their nervous system means that they're going to lash out very quickly to keep themselves safe. It's maybe not so much that they're planning, oh, I'm going to attack all these people, but that's what the body tells them is necessary. And to try and rectify that, we really need to do some somatic work with people's bodies and teach people other tools of navigating conflict. But often it's not a cognitive thing. And, I sometimes say at events, safe boys, safe, happy, healthy boys do not carry knives. So if we want to target knife crime, for example, we need to look at the conditions that are creating this sense of urgency that boys, mainly boys, feel I need to go around with a knife to keep myself safe, or maybe keep my drug stash safe, or whatever it is. Because safe, regulated, healthy, happy people don't carry knives. They just don't. It wouldn't enter their head. They wouldn't think. The risks of doing so are too high, and the consequences of being caught with one are too high. And the rational part of their brain is more open to thinking through consequences. But if all you're trying to do is survive, then carrying a knife might make sense at a particular level. So I think, violent crime, sexual crimes as well. I think for, only a tiny percentage of perpetrators ever get prosecuted and convicted. But once you're convicted, I think that can blind people to the fact that you were other things as well. That you could have been a decent husband or father, as well as this awful thing that you've done. And that is also because we like to distance ourselves from certain behaviors and kind of other people, and not realize that there's many perpetrators in our midst who are other things. They're doctors, they're lawyers, they're bankers, they're teachers, they're maybe very kind, but they have this problem behavior in them for whatever reason that has caused indescribable pain and suffering to other people. So it's I'm not trying to minimize, I'm just saying there's more to everyone than the bad things that they have done. And I don't think our justice system really goes to the root of why people do things. And to try and interrupt the cycle again, for those who are convicted of sexually harmful behavior as well, what are we doing to prevent that from occurring again in the future? Are we doing enough? I'm not sure that we are, because we don't, like, therapy is most effective when it's chosen, and coercive therapy is problematic. So again, I don't have answers, but I think sometimes having frank and honest discussions with people about the why of their behavior is sometimes lacking, regardless of the offense type. But great question, Eve. Thanks.
No, thank you. Yeah. I think we spoke a few episodes ago with Lisa about kind of like the othering of abusers, and how that is kind of like a deflection because people don't want to identify with them at all. So So they kind of like go, oh, well, it's this group of people, or it's not my problem to deal with because these are the kind of people that do that, and I don't identify with that, or whatever. But I think that kind of leads to another question that I had as well, which is kind of like about allyship, because actually when we did our conference last week, someone asked me about, because I'm not a survivor, and they asked, did I think it was harder for people to be allies when they haven't had like some kind of experience, because they don't know what the experience is, like what is it that stops people from being allies. And I think it's because one, it's quite exhausting. It can be quite tiring. I think people don't really want to take on the responsibility of being an ally because they can't be bothered, for want of better words. But I also think that again, it's like another deflection kind of thing of people being like, well, like they don't want to admit that it could have been something that happened to them, or it could be someone that they know that's doing that, or that there is even something they could do to stop it. So I was just wondering like what your thoughts on allyship was, and kind of what the importance of allyship in any form, really.
I think it's really important to be an ally if you can. Now, again, I go back to what I said before. There are reasons, a range of reasons why people can't or won't or don't want to. And it could be that something has happened to people and they've repressed it or can't remember it or just cannot go there. It could be that. It could be that the pain that they, or the discomfort that they feel when they just hear certain things like child sexual abuse, that someone is a survivor. I felt it myself. The same with domestic violence, this rock hard tightening in your stomach. And the urge then to run away from that feeling is very strong. But we can't all run away from it, and we can't just leave people on their own with this pain, because healing, you can't do it entirely on your own, for one thing. And I've had many experiences over the last few years where, you know, people have told me something and I try my best to respond in as good a way as I can. And by that, I mean just listening and kind of validating, believing them, because people don't make these things up, I don't believe, or for the vast majority, they don't, because it's not glamorous. It's not conducive to getting a warm, receptive response from a lot of people. So I just try and listen, and then also try and realize that's not everything that they are. It's the same if someone is a perpetrator of a violent act or has been addicted for a long time. That is not all they are. It's something they've become, coping strategies they've become, but they may not know who they really are because of things that have happened to them. And I think the same is true often of survivors, is that they may not know entirely who they are because all of these adaptations or maladaptive behaviors have blinded them from who they are or have interrupted their development. And I think now, as I've learned more, I know I have a role to play, even if it's a small role in that person's journey. And it might be just by just looking at them and commending them for their activism, or for for trying to raise awareness, for speaking things that are unspeakable, bringing it into public consciousness. It needs to be brought into public consciousness. And that doesn't mean it's going to be an easy journey and that people won't want to turn and run away. Like Judith Herman has a phrase about incest groups, and the importance of being able to say something and not have people scurrying from the room like rats. I think it's a great description of what can happen. And survivors need people to come back into the room. The rats need to return to the room, I guess, and sort of listen and try to just sit with their physiological and emotional discomfort, because most people do not like the idea of children being abused. Most people, because most people are not perpetrators of this harm. Too many are, but those who are not would like it to end. They would prefer it not to occur. But they have a role to play in that. And I mean, what I find interesting is actually mandated persons. So teachers or social workers, even they don't really want to know about these things. You know, that's really interesting, because they have an active role to report and they prefer not to know. And yet they don't want these things to be happening. So there's all these impediments, I think, to doing the right thing. And of course, people may not want to hear it, because then they have to make a decision. What is the right thing to do? And they have to report. But then they might know, Rob, you were talking about children's homes and foster care and all of that, looked after children. There are huge difficulties with our systems in this regard, and people know that they might report, and then is it only going to make the child's life actually worse? It is the not knowing what will happen next, the not knowing, am I going to improve matters? So I think there's so many reasons why people can avoid being allies, but I think what helps with conferences, with the kind of talks that I do in a more general way of trying to map things together and show how it all knocks on, and not listening to a child, or kind of freezing when an adult tells you something and making them feel, or walking away from them as quickly as you can, and the rejection and the abandonment that a person can feel there, that we are then adding to the pain and the problem. So that if we can just breathe and just even continue the conversation, or put our touch is a difficult one, but maybe just I don't know, ask, is it okay if I touch your arm? Or we can get things wrong even with the best of intentions, but the not bolting emotionally, psychologically, verbally, or physically, I think is important. But I think that urge is a real impediment to allyship, whatever the subject matter. The urge to pretend that all drugs are intrinsically addictive and that that's the problem, rather than looking at trauma. That is the desire to deceive ourselves is strong, and to believe that it is just the substance that is intrinsically addictive, or it's a chemical imbalance in the brain, rather than attachment problems or the conditions of people's lives. We'd much rather the lies that we've been told a lot of the time than actually have people tell us the truth. So those are some barriers to allyship. But being educated, having awareness come to us that we can be a tiny part of the healing process for someone, just by trying to connect with them, or at least not disconnecting from them when they share something with us. Like that should be, for me at this point, it's an honor and a privilege if someone tells me something. I mightn't always want to hear it, or it might be overwhelming, but it is an honor and a privilege that someone wants to share something. And if I can make that a positive experience for them, I would rather do that. And I think we can all learn that little by little, and get better about doing it.
Yeah, I think there's a element of people kind of being scared to fail at it, I think, as well. Like they don't want to do the wrong thing, or
I think
anything
that's
like
really
that.
true. Not wanting to re-traumatize. Like, you'll often hear that about, we can't learn about trauma, we can't become trauma informed because, we'll only re-traumatize people. People are being re-traumatized right and left regardless. And in a way, of course we don't want to actively re-traumatize people, but I do think if we get it wrong, or if our face freezes, let's say, when someone discloses something like child sexual abuse, if we even say, I'm sorry, I wasn't prepared for that, and, just honor the fact that we didn't know how to react, but it's not because we're revolted by the person or anything like that, if you get me, that we just were taken a little bit aback, because so many of our responses that we kind of, that people then feel are about them, are actually about us. They're not about the person at all, or the disclosure. They're about how our bodies feel and our own emotional regulation or dysregulation in the moment. So by even acknowledging, oh, my face, kind of, sorry, I didn't mean that. That is a little moment of repair, maybe, whether the person believes it or not. I think it's better to try and do that if you notice, or come back afterwards if you've the opportunity, if you mishandle a disclosure, to say, I didn't handle that the best. I'm sorry. I was a bit surprised, but it, how can I support you now? Is there anything that I can do now? Because it is a learning process, I think, for people that, unless you go to disclosure workshops, many people are not going to know necessarily in advance how to deal with these things, and they can get it wrong. And, but I do think just reflecting and tuning into our bodies more in general is a very good lesson, and trying to even to breathe, and not panic so much. Yeah, but people do worry about getting it wrong, and in that they can freeze. They can literally freeze, and that can then be read as rejection and all sorts. So doing workshops with folks like yourselves, or the Flying Child Project, or various other projects that have a specific brief and mandate, I think are very valuable, particularly for mandated persons, to learn tools and coping strategies, because the chances are some people are going to hear more stories than other people are, if they work in certain roles.
Can I just go back to the beginning, because a lot there, so really, really interesting, is about female mother, kind of female kind of projections of distress onto children and things. My own mother was violent, so I've written about it. And, it was really difficult as a 4 or 5-year-old. I have no real memory of it, but I would walk around the streets for hours around where I lived. Neighbours had concerns. My mother wasn't sadistic, though. I think, she was dysregulated, and that could be instant. But there was no sadism in my mother. But I think when sadism exists, whether it's male or female who's committing those behaviours against the child, I think that's when you start to get lots of issues, I suspect, is the sadistic part of it. I think you learned as a child to navigate dysfunction by getting yourself out of the way, basically, of the barrage that was coming. Whereas if sadistic kind of environments, it's hard to escape them because it's constant there. I think the issues around people avoiding disclosure and not handling very well, and the way we see perpetrators of all forms of dysfunction. And a lesson that was taught to me at the very beginning of my activism was we have to remember these people are human beings. And I was like, well, how can you be a human being if you're a paedophile? And they kind of said, well, if we don't, we'll never resolve it because there'll always be the monster. And until we see them for what they really are as human beings with very dysfunctional behaviours that often we don't truly understand what's driving them, we'll never get to the heart of the solution for it. Because we'll always be the monster, and there'll always be hidden in the shadows. There'll always be something that comes from the woods and eats our children rather than sitting in our living rooms having dinner with us. And, that's what we need to see, that they're not monsters because they're human beings. Their behaviours are monstrous. That's what I was told. But they're not monsters. They're us. And they're a reflection of us that we are frightened to look at because they're our shadow. And we all have shadows, as Jung pointed out. So how do we deal with all those, and how do we deal with the sensitivities as a conversation goes on in our sector at the moment about working with male survivors who are also perpetrated sexual violence. And they're given the title of, as systems do, dual status. And it causes a tension for some of us to give dual status to them in both their victimhood and their perpetration status. And give it duality is challenging for some of us, for people, because we don't think there is a duality in it for some of us. We think it needs to be seen differently, because your victimization is different to the perpetration element of the abuser. So that just language itself can create tensions where there has been hurt, basically, where there is a sense of unfairness and injustice, and that this always constant pressure on survivor organizations to kind of, in some ways, step out of the way, because, we'll deal with the child, we'll not deal with the adult, because we need to focus on the children, yet they never focused on the child either, so there's no money flows into children's services, regardless of the pressure to reduce adult pressures services. So this word, Herman's called trauma, complex trauma, because it's multiple events. Actually, the cultural issues that surround it are complex, multiple re-traumas and rebooting of the denial that's creating the pipeline for all of this. So I can understand why workers step back from it and don't want to deal with it or feel they can't deal with it. But the answers all lie within that world. All the answers are sitting in front of systems, only if they kind of deployed the resources and the energy and the political will to actually deal with it. So you have an environment here where political will was driven by £200 million inquiry into child sexual abuse, sat on a shelf for 2 years. And it's only because a billionaire who's switched his kind of mental thoughts about what is democracy kind of called out a government minister, that you saw rapid political will to kind of deal with the issue that had been put forward on that inquiry. And that shouldn't happen, shouldn't it? We shouldn't have to wait for a crazy billionaire guy with a rocket fixation to kind of change, to drive the protection of children, basically.
No, it's true. And I think you make an interesting and an important point there about the victim offender overlap. Certainly in the wider criminal justice setting, it's perhaps it's under-recognized in general. Like when I was doing my PhD, probation officers might have spoken about offenders as victims of social policy. So again, the poverty, the poor school attainment, unemployment, those type of things, single parent families, not so much recognition of the complex trauma from childhood, the abuse, the neglect, the child sexual abuse, the violence in the community, those type of things that fed addiction and led to drug-related theft or violence. And it's hard enough to get people to look there and kind of say, well, you can be both the child victim, and sometimes children were victims of serious offences for which no one was ever charged or held accountable. So if you're trying to work with someone and say, well, where's the empathy for your victim? I can see why you're missing a trick if you don't acknowledge the victimhood that led to the perpetration in a general sense. But that's tricky. People still don't want to do that because, again, it's easier to kind of think, well, people made bad choices by starting to use drugs in the first place and blame them for those choices, or that they're trying to make money from local drug dealing networks and just don't want to get up to go to work like the rest of us, kind of thing. To have these middle class biases come in when we cannot imagine what we might be like under different circumstances. If people have had a safe enough, happy enough, regulated, loving enough childhood, they've no clue what they might have otherwise become. So that's another problem, I think, in dealing with this, is the lack of imagination through privilege and safety, actually. And that's something I've learned. I've no doubt that I would be so much worse than I am today had I had less luck and love and privilege in my life. But to come back to the dual status within the sexual violence world, I think that's particularly fraught, because the harm is a very specific, unique harm. And for people who were violated as innocent children, I know Sophie from The Flying Child has very little truck with, hurt people hurt other people, does not like that phrase because, as I understand it, she views it as letting people off the hook, which is certainly not acceptable. Just because you've had something terrible happen to you is no green light to go off and do it to other people. Of course it's not. That said, there will be a proportion of people for whom they were victimized in this way, and then the traumatic reenactment cycle or whatever, the regaining, I don't know what the reasons are for it really, the power dynamics, the unhealthy sexual script that people can develop leads them to offend in similar ways maybe to which they were violated in. And in a way, doesn't make any difference actually there, well, there is the reality of being the victim, but it doesn't take from the offense, it certainly doesn't. And it might have implications though for treatment, so for people who have had an abuse history of their own, perhaps different things need to be worked on than for people who have not had that as part of their histories. Attachment, I think, is also a part of this, though, and the Good Lives model for sexual offending or dealing with sexually harmful behaviour looks at people's attachment patterns as well, and why couldn't they form safe, healthy, loving relationships with appropriate people in their lives, So I don't know. I have no answers in this regard. I certainly have respect for survivor voices who have an intolerance or, again, an aversion to looking at the person in their entirety. But I suppose in general, I do think we should look at people in their entirety. And again, perhaps that is my privilege of not having experienced the harm that some people have experienced. I just think for interrupting the cycle, it might be important. If people are going to get out, if they're going to be released from prison into the community, we need to be responding as best we can in a rehabilitative setting. So I think it might be relevant there. But we just need to listen to people's views. And again, validate the fact that it is a legitimate feeling and perspective to have to not care actually why someone is. It's just my own perspective is generally to want to know the whys, and there can be layers of the whys there.
So the discussion that goes on about it is all about these kind of terminologies that systems often place onto people. There is no argument about the reality that we need services for those who sexually offend, whether they have histories of being offended against themselves or not. And there are some therapists who argue, well, you can deal with the survivor bit without dealing with the offender bit. I'm not quite sure how you do that personally, but they hold that position. I personally think you need very standalone specialist services, because I don't think you can give 6 months of counselling to somebody who's sexually offended against children and deal with both their offending behaviour and their experience of being offended against in 6 months. I just don't know how you do that. I think you need long-term programs that are very specialist and exceptionally well staffed with people who really know how to navigate those extra complexities and unpack them in a way that actually is empowering to the individual, because they're not monsters, they are human beings, their acts are monstrous, but at the same time works to have prevention so they don't reoffend, and that you get to the heart of it, if it's possible to get to the heart of it with some of them, I suspect. So you need to kind of do that. And survivors who haven't offended may have offended in other ways. The sexual offending thing is a kind of, it's a line. It's a kind of line that's very sensitive for lots of people. but they may have offended in a domestic violence context in relation to being emotionally coercive, for instance. So they constantly distrust their partner and are always checking up on them. They may not physically assault them, but they're constantly psychologically assaulting them with a need for constant reassurance that they're not being betrayed, whether that's conscious or unconscious. Some of them are physical, so they may lose it in effect and get so dysregulated that they don't beat them up, but they may get to a stage where they have to shake them against the wall and they're kind of acting out and may even put their hands around their throats because they want to choke them because they're leaving them or something. They don't actually act that out. So those wouldn't be uncommon. They're not persistent, regular domestic violence kind of relationships. They're explosions of unregulated, unprocessed emotional from childhood often. And we need services to deal with those, and we work with clients who come into those categories. We don't work with clients who have sexual offending histories or disclose them. I'm sure we've had clients who've gone through our service who have actually had those histories. They just don't disclose them in the counselling. So I'm not sure the counselling really helps them because they're not disclosing it. But we kind of have those. I'm sure that's occurred. It would be naive to believe that you have hundreds and thousands of clients who are all saying they're non-offending, and there's not some of them there who have sexual offending history. But they need specialist treatment, and I'm sure they get it. I'm not sure anybody knows. The Lucy Faithfull Foundation is the agency that I've known of for over 25 years as kind of pioneering working in that space. But do we really know whether it works or not? That's the question. What do we need to put into that space, into those individuals, to stop them further perpetrating? And clearly some of them are very, very dangerous predators who I'm not sure how much therapy you would have to give them, if therapy would be the right word to stop them. But the majority of them are probably stoppable with the right therapy because they're opportunists, aren't they? They're kind of within the family, really.
The other thing, though, I think that is, concerns me a lot is pornography on the internet, and the fact that, okay, it's grand to be curious maybe, and we are sexual beings and have drives and this, that and the other, but again, with mobile phones and young people's brains and like overconsumption of very graphic material from a young age, and maybe disconnected relationships with parents or friends or family, and then you've the Tates, and then you have the President of the United States, who is, a sexual predator, a known sexual predator, and many of his appointees are. The messages that we are giving to young men and men, perhaps they've always been there, but the ease of accessing explicit material has never been as easy as it is today. And, I think this, from people in the field, I've heard that there's increasing sexual abuse by brothers against their siblings. Again, who gets prioritized in that? Does it become about preventing the boy's future offending rather than healing the daughter or the other children? And what does that do to that victim, that child, that survivor? Hugely complex. I don't have the answers, but we need to not be allowing young boys in their rooms all day and all night on these harmful websites and expect them to be well. To be quite honest, I think that's hugely neglectful of parents to think you can just overconsume addictive material that changes the structures in your brain. The dopamine receptors are firing from more and more aggressive material, and then expect it not to play out in the real world. We're insane if we think it'll just stay in the person's bedroom, or it might, but they become more and more in need of other types of material and might stray into child sexual abuse material. So there are real victims in this, and an awful lot of the material on some of these sites is maybe not even consensual material. So I am concerned about this. I'm concerned about the repercussions, obviously for the victims, whether male or female. If they don't want to be in these videos, that's a huge violation. But I'm also very concerned about what it's doing to people's brains and bodies if they look at too much of it, and how they then will apply this in the real world with future sexual partners. It's kind of mind-boggling and a small bit terrifying. I'm sure you're seeing the consequences in your own day-to-day work as well, as people maybe struggle with porn addiction. And this is the thing, it's rising all the time. There's a huge need for it. I mean, a need for treatment or some sort of services. A friend of mine who does some therapy in this area says a lot of it, again, comes back to attachment and unhealthy attachment patterns, or insecure or avoidant attachment, or other things, that's at least part of it. And it just strikes me that there's going to be a growing need for services and supports.
So we did a conference last week talking about males in my workshop. And one of the things that scares me is the number of boys who are being reported to being sexually exploited on the internet, to kind of being groomed into situations. And those numbers, they represent over 90%
Wow.
of those crimes. So my prediction is, and they're mostly 12 to 15, so they're being exploring their sexuality, exploring sex. So my generation, it was a copy of Penthouse that you found around the school playground somewhere, and that was a secret little thing with Playboy. So a copy of Playboy in W.H. Smith's on the top shelf before it was really naughty to have a quick look at it. Now I understand that the average 8 or 9-year-old boy and girl has viewed explicit material that, most 18, 19, 20-year-olds of my generation would have very rarely kind of seen. And also what you begin to see is the impacts. And I remember a stark example of that is the fall in underage pregnancies in the United Kingdom. And they could not work out how all these teenagers who were constantly having, the figures were almost constant for nearly 40 years, suddenly went significantly. It wasn't just 5% significance. It was kind of like 60 to 70% drop in underage pregnancies. And when they looked at it, what they discovered was that the hypothesis is that because the internet is encouraging anal sex, that the anal sex behaviors had become the norm in teenage sexual activity. And of course, whilst we may kind of say, oh my, anal sex is actually safer than vaginal sex in relation to pregnancy risk. So that's why the numbers are. So it's a social behaviour. So boys are out there becoming the guy who's just gone to America, whose name's just dropped out of my head. Yeah, Tate, being welcomed by the American president, in effect, and doing this stuff and encouraging all this. Girls want attachments. Girls want boyfriends. Girls want to feel they're attractive and they're loved. And of course, sexual behaviour between teenagers is not a rarity. It's a kind of experiment. And, so they're now changing their behaviours to kind of meet boys' expectations, because those things are happening. We have no idea where all that's going, I don't think.
No.
And there's a big debate. I've just seen a paper about pornography, because there's always been a debate within feminism. Pornography is a complex violence.
Yeah.
But there's another argument that comes from another side of the argument that, yes, coercive pornography is a bad thing, but actually pornography in its own right is a good thing, because it's where it's consensual, all the players and actors within it are choosing to that because it's a business, only fans or whatever you call it, where that's occurring, then that shouldn't be banned. And you should have a right to view it, because if it's consensually created and you enjoy doing that and there's no expectation going on, then you have a right, you get pleasure from it. You should be able to watch it. Clearly, children should be safeguarded from those materials. I don't know how you actually do that, but, because they can just go and find their way into those sites, and they understand the internet. So they just kind of live within that world. So all of those things are going on, and, within that landscape is this massive kind of vulnerability, isn't it, really, for children especially, to be exploited. not just in the realm of the digital, but in the realms that generate from it in relation to the offline world where they're playing out relationships as well. And all of that, and I don't think our systems and our politicians or anybody else has the foggiest idea how to deal with it except to let it play out.
No, and of course, all children are vulnerable. I also believe we're all vulnerable,
So,
to a greater or lesser degree throughout our lives, depending on what's going on for us.
yeah.
But all children are vulnerable. Some are more vulnerable than others, if they have no one in their world paying attention to them, who is checking up on them, who wants to know where they're going or who are they talking to, or there's a load of parents who are happy that their children are at home online thinking that they're safe. But they don't want to go there about what their children might be doing or who they might be doing it with. And I was at an event years ago where this digital person was saying, it's kind of like you leave your toddler at the playground for 3 hours on their own and say, I'll be back in a while. And then you come back and they're there, and they're not dead. That in a way, leaving children unsupervised on the internet for hours on end, day in, day out. That's what parents are doing. They're leaving their toddler alone in the playground for hours. It's a good analogy because, there are all manner of dangerous predators around the internet or unsafe material that's distorting their minds. But I think as well, neurodivergent children are more susceptible. Autistic children who may not have many friends in the real world, might be online gaming. Who knows? There are people coming in my own son is autistic, and I'd be very aware of his vulnerability. He's mainly playing games, but he's downstairs in the living room with us, causing consternation half the time, making noise. But at least he's there where we are. He's not up in his room on his own all the time. And, people can be sensory seeking as well. I think perhaps some of the content producers are neurodivergent, not saying they shouldn't be involved in this, but I think there's so many ways that we haven't a clue what's going on, what the impacts are, how free is the choice at times. Do people fully understand what they're doing? Again, I don't have the answers, but it's just a bit mind-boggling how much of the material is out there, how much money is to be made from it, and the impacts on child development. I think if they're accessing it again, for girls, it's the expectations that girls have now about what they should and shouldn't be doing. Like they mightn't even know that they've been sexually violated at times because of what they might have seen on the internet. Even that people don't have a name for how things might have been uncomfortable or moved at a pace or in a direction that they didn't want. We seriously need very, honest, up-to-date sexual education and stuff around consent for children that's not being done by, the nuns or whatever in various schools. That is by young, hip people who are attuned to all of the issues and not afraid to answer questions, I think, because I wouldn't know where to begin really. With my own children, I try and be honest, but it's not always easy to know what the right thing to say is.
Yeah, and it's a problem that is just going to kind of expand and develop, I think, as technology expands. And AI is coming as well. So, the AI elements of it now, when you look at some of the stuff that's being generated by AI, and I struggle to know whether or not that's real or not. So, and I think I have a keen eye for imagery. It just looks too good to be true. And I think that's kind of my instinct of it. That's just too good to be true, too sharp to be real. So, but it is real. It looks real.
That's an important point too, I think, about other types of harm. There's image-based sexual abuse or sharing of images without consent that is extremely harmful. But I think other people are being harmed. It's not even them. It's not their bodies, but their faces are being stuck to images. And it feels as if it's real because the harm is real. The violation is real. to have that put out into the world. So there are crimes now that can be committed that did not exist a few years ago. And people need education around that. We need to look at what is driving people to want to violate, ex-girlfriends or girls at school or whoever in these very cruel, brutal ways as well, and I think we can't leave it all to parents, because parents are sometimes incompetent or too ashamed or too inhibited, or they just don't even know. So this is where schools have to come in, and programs have to be developed as the technology advances, that as a new type of harm becomes known, it's addressed as quickly as possible to minimize future victims as well. For me, it's all about trying to interrupt the creation of new victims along the way. And, I would have to think as well that if people are harming others in this way, we need to look at why are they doing this? What is up for them that they think this is acceptable behavior? Because it's not. It's so deeply harmful.
I'm conscious of time, so we've kind of I could talk all day, Jane, to you. We could
Me too, Rob. Me too.
But, I think, we're at a point of society's at a point of my personal final perspective on for this kind of conversation today is, it's a pivot point for society. All the things that are going on at the moment in relation to our political structures, our civil structures, the whole way our systems work, the way we look at economics itself is kind of that point, as we approach the first end of the first quarter of the 21st century, is a kind of wake up call, really, to what we want and to deal with all these issues. But as you kind of saying when you're talking about female mother perpetration of violence, is like we don't talk about it, do we? Because we don't, and there's a nervousness about talking about it because you might get attacked by a group with other people who decide that you're undermining, some other process. And actually, you can only undermine truth in order to, if you decide only parts of the truth can be told. What you need to do is deal with it all and put it all on the table and actually look at it. And I can see politicians just looking at you in the sky and thinking, go back to your planet, because that can never happen. But if it doesn't happen, I think these problems are only going to get worse, because I think the technology, the growth of the way people are manipulated by the algorithms inside those software programs is just going to get worse and worse. And who knows where that leads to. So the truth needs to be on the table, because it's the only way you can start to defuse those algorithms and actually have the conversations that are actually necessary in society and change its systems and its way of approaching things, and actually make that investment, because that is what will change the future for children in a way that, currently I'm not sure that's going to happen.
I suppose, we have to accept that a lot of people don't know what we know. And some people will be resistant to what we know for various reasons, whether personal or political. There'll be people who, certainly from my perspective, when looking at perpetrators of crimes, will say you're just making excuses for bad behavior, and no, I'm not. I'm not really. I want to understand, and I think an awareness of trauma, its prevalence and its impact, when combined in particular with poverty and structural violence, that is the context in which crime flourishes, particularly the more generic types of crime and drug-related crime. So we need to get real about that and try and tackle all of it. But if we eradicated poverty in the morning, I don't think we would get rid of all of these other things. That's the point. So we need to try and reduce the stress of poverty, create conditions for safety and love and nurturance and flourishing for all children. But to do that, we need to create safety, love, flourishing and poverty reduction for the adults in their worlds, and to acknowledge the wounds that they have. So I think, the more of us that raise awareness of these complex issues, the better. The more we try and speak in a language that people can understand, that we boil the science into terms that people can understand, make it relevant to them, not shame people for wanting to run from their own emotions, because there are good reasons for why people do that, why they want to numb their visceral body sensations with drugs and alcohol if they've experienced too much. It's kind of taking some of the shame and blame of those responses away. But our politicians are also quite traumatized people, many of them. And so that can be part of the reason why they don't want to look at this as issues. And also then the electoral cycle, it's only a short period in which they have to govern. So engaging with civil servants, I think, is very important. Trying to raise awareness, build relationships, sometimes bite our lips again when the pace of change isn't what we might want. Hopefully it'll continue to move in the right direction, but I just think it's all too important to let lie. And I don't believe that trauma is a buzzword. I think it's not glamorous, it's not sexy, but it is real and it's very common, and it's not people over there. You know, sometimes that's the reason for the resistance. It's because it's the people over here don't want or can't sit with the realities that they're hearing. Or it can just make people go, but I'm so successful, you know, I'm so successful in my career, but relationally I'm a mess. Or as a parent, I'm very disconnected. So that can be so confronting. But I think we need to continue to confront gently and breathe.
Good to breathe.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you have both said. And just want to say thank you, Jane, for joining us. It's been a really great conversation.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you. Thank you. It was great. Thank you.